in every conflict, children suffer most. As adults, we never give them a chance to express what they saw, what they heard, or how did that make them feel.
It was important for this process for the Commission to listen to children because children have issues. And whenever there are problems in any community, it is always the children who have the brunt of everything that goes wrong.
Children have a unique level of victimization for two reasons. One, because they're doubly targeted. First, directly, they may be targeted. For example, recruited as child soldiers, as porters, cooks, to take part in the warfare. And then secondly, indirectly, when their support system around them is attacked or targeted. So if children loses his or her parents, guardians, access to school, misses out on the chance to get an education, no access to health care, proper nutrition, and those will affect their own development for years to come.
I think a lot of people also forget that children are sponges. Repeat what they hear.
For example, children would, if you'd see them pray together, they would see them praying the prayers of like holding guns, like fire, what they saw. But as adults, at times we don't even take that into consideration because that's an indication of violence.
Their experience on this planet is a lot less in terms of years. And so when they see events happen, I mean, the image, they don't have a basis for comparison yet. And so it's a first-time experience. And so the image is very real, very new, and very fresh and very scary.
A truth commission by nature is intended to be victim-centered, trying to get the stories, the voices that weren't heard during a period of authoritarian regime or conflict, get them out there so that the truth is known about the past. And in order for that to happen, you have to get the different voices of the different victims. And in these cases, we can't ignore the voices of children.
With children, you see that really they are victims in the true sense of the word. And so if it is a victim-focused process, then very early in the day, the Commission has got to be alive to that so that in its final report, it is able to very clearly show what victimhood really means. And I think the clearest demonstration would be through children, through the voices of children.
Children and youth form at least half, if not more, of the population. So demographically speaking, when we're trying to design a victim-centered process, it's essential that we factor children sufficiently in that process, because if they're at least half the population, there's a good chance that a large majority of them have been victimized directly or indirectly and therefore need adequate space and adequate voice in the Truth Commission process.
As a commission, we are to come up with a complete and accurate record of historical injustices and human rights violations. And a complete and accurate record will not be complete without the voice of the children.
But when they grow up without being helped to be able to deal with that, they have a lot of anger within them, and you'll hear them say, I can also kill. Or when they grow, as they grow up, they keep on saying, when I grow up, I want to be a policeman because I want to get hold of that gadget and do what they did to my parents.
according to the Convention of the Rights of the Child, children have a right to be involved in processes that affect them. So a Truth Commission would fall squarely within that. It's a process in which they should be given the space to speak their voice, tell their story, and then also have that passed on to them in a way that they can also then understand. They should participate, not just because it's a right, but also it will make the Commission stronger. It'll make the possibility of a more general uptake of the Commission's finding possible, and increase the chances that then what's found through the research, through the hearing, through the testimony, will inform future decisions so that these violations are never repeated.
We went to the refugee camp in Kiriandogo, that's in Uganda, and we had gone to hear the refugees, and we found children, and the children said, "You must also hear us." Then they wrote down their stories, their experiences of refugeehood. These were children not whom we sought out, but children who said, if you are looking for information, then we also must have our space.
Children are a very big stakeholder. When it comes to issues of violence, the most sufferers are the children. Actually, they should be first on the agenda, even before we look at the adults. Yeah. Because they are the ones who suffer most, and they're the ones who live with the suffering for longer than even the other people.
And in most cases, children are not cancelled, they are not given time to hear their issues, they are never consulted. And it was important for TGRC to listen to children, to know what children have been through, what they go through, what they don't like, and for them to give their recommendations as to what sort of country, Kenya, they would like to have.
Right from the start.
From the very outset.
From the very start.
Right from the beginning.
From the start, from the time the process started.
I think for any country that is looking to set up a TRC, it's important to also have a focus on children. So it's important that right from the mandate, from the crafting of the act or the mechanism that establishes the Truth Commission, there's a specific focus on children, so that would always be at the forefront of those who are running the commission and responsible for implementing its mandate.
Please, do you have a budget for children? They said no. In fact, they said we are writing a proposal to UNICEF, to World Bank, to help us with the money. Because when they started off, they didn't have money. Their money somehow was held. So they were actually looking for money from other sources to be able to do some of their work. They even approached us and said, do you have money for this process? You know. So, but we told them, yeah, as a commission, when it was formed, you should have a budget for that.
Staff designated specifically to the different target groups. So, for example, for children, having people designated to that specifically.
If you have the resources, bring on board somebody who understands this process from start to finish. If you don't have the resources, find them.
Have commissioners from beginning to end just dealing with the issue of children.
It's also about having people that really know how to interact with kids, because this is not something that easy. You know, it's not that everybody can just get into a group of like 15 children and let them, you know, express themselves. That things doesn't happen, and there's a need to create trust and to build a space in which they feel confident and they can develop the means they want to express themselves.
What we did was invite the child rights organizations. Then kind of we allowed them to guide us on how the process, you know, how we engage with children.
I think it's really important to reach out to other organizations that can be associated with the process in civil society and in international organizations. So this is where you get the expertise, and is by associating people. You don't need necessarily to have all the expertise on the team, especially when it's to design processes.
What happened with the way that we engaged is we relied more on civil society to educate children on the process and the work of the commission. Whereas I think maybe we should have been taken more of the lead in terms of civic education.
We need to have a specific questionnaire for children. It will not be the same questionnaire like everybody else.
So in thinking about children and truth commissions, it's important not to lump children as one homogeneous group. First of all, the age range is 0 to 18, so the needs and capabilities of adolescents, so a 12 to 18-year-old, are very different than those of a 5 to 10-year-old.
So we help them in coming up with even statement-taking forms, because we understand. Because previously they were using the forms which were used by the TGRC to interview the adults could not be used. So we started from there. We said now we are going to look at the issue of children, because we wanted the questions to be child-friendly.
We had statement takers from our partners, trained social workers, trained counselors, and we sat with them several times to discuss the statement-taking tool for children, because it's totally different from the one for the adults. We went through it, we constructed it, we reconstructed it, several meetings, so that we came up with a tool that could extract information from children. And we all had agreed together with the partners, this is good for children, this is will not traumatize children, and this will make children open up and state their issues.
In Liberia, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did a lot to advance the way in which children are involved in truth commissions, and it was really groundbreaking on many levels. And working together with child protection agencies, they developed a statement-taking form specifically for children that was different from the adult one. However, it was developed a little bit later in the process, and by then the database had already been established, and the coding matched the adult statement-taking form, but was incompatible with the children's statement-taking form, so they weren't able to use it in the end. They attached some guidelines on interviewing children, certain tips to the adult statement-taking form, but that's an instance where, had this been done from the start, the database could have also factored in those specific forms. So just a lesson in terms of trying to have this as one more filter, one more lens that those who are planning and designing truth commissions integrate into how they set up their structures.
We had to train also these statement takers on how they can get information from the children, because these are things which are psychological. If you just take somebody who cannot actually handle children well, then you can leave the child worse than you found the child. But now we wanted them to be supported, and then they get continuous support. So we had to train the statement takers, those who maybe have not been having the experience of handling issues of children.
The commissioners also had a guide on how to interview children and how to talk to children, and the special support unit, including the counselors, had meeting with the commissioners prior on how they would interview or speak to the children.
I think it needed to have a lot of outreach before you started operations. So this was not possible due to various challenges. This is for children and others. I think what we faced when we started statement taking, which was the first sort of operational activity, it was that people didn't know about the Truth Commission. There was the special court at the same time, so there was a lot of confusion. If we had had time to properly do media relations and outreach, I think then you could have involved, sensitized parents maybe on how to involve children, the necessity to involve children, to give them a voice. This would have necessitated a lot more time.
It's important to develop materials that are accessible to children, and this can be from written material, which has to be developed in a child-friendly manner in terms of the language that it uses, or like the length, the way in which complex terms are explained, to many other possibilities of materials that are especially pedagogical, like using interactive maps or cartoons, audiovisual material, radio. There's many different possibilities in how we want to frame that materials.
Resources that would have been useful would perhaps be information, education and communication materials specifically targeted at children, how to break down the mandate and the work of the Commission to a children's audience.
So one of the things we've seen that works really well, it's when children talk to children. So actually not having the commission or the tribunal giving the message to children, but getting children involved in the whole process and develop their own messages. And something that has been, for example, very successful or very interesting is the radio Kids Talk to Kids programs in Sierra Leone, which are just programs that are done by kids. And it's not only that they frame it in their own language and in their own way of expressing things, but it's also something they take ownership of, because they are actually learning to do something, and they are taking ownership of the whole process, and this is also a learning experience. It's not the same thing to receive passively some information than actually to get involved in developing yourself that information. And it's also this way in which interaction is triggered in a more natural manner.
We organized with the partners in Nakuru to be able to, first of all, have sessions. We didn't do it just as getting children, grabbing them and taking them to Nairobi to go and make their views. But rather we created that conducive environment where we had our workshops for them and just organized a general workshop for them to brief them on what's expected of them, what we want to hear from their stories, and also be able to get them to put their views together.
It's a delicate approach, especially for issues where they have witnessed violence or they themselves have been victims of violence upon their person, and of course emotional violence. You always want to make sure that there is some kind of a counselor in the room, a social worker in the room, that you've got parent and guardian approval for this particular interview to take place, because you're not quite sure what kind of Pandora's box of emotions it's going to open up, and they need to be in a safe place. The questions posed to a child, you'd like them to be as open-ended as possible. You want that child to tell you in their own words, not in your words. And that means also recognizing that the child may not be able to tell you in English as accurately as in their own native language, which means that you have to have an interpreter on hand who understands the nuances of what's trying to be conveyed and convey it to you in a way that the English-speaking or French-speaking population or Spanish-speaking population might be able to understand.
Also find out other ways of reaching out to the children or the other groups. Because there's some people, if you really use speaking and talking as the only way of collecting views, there's some people who don't talk. How do you get their views? There's some people maybe if they had a game, play a game, it'll have made sense to the children, or make a song. It'll have made sense to even the adults. They could express themselves through song. People could express themselves through art. So be able to look at all media of communication.
As the Commission, we decided to have hearings specifically for children. There were 2 different hearings. There was one panel of commissioners listened to caregivers of children, particularly children with disabilities, and also heard from child protection agencies and youth groups and other individuals working with children. The other panel heard directly from children, and that was set up in a way to try and enhance children's participation.
The children who were brought for the actual hearing when we had the thematic hearing for children, Well prepared. We started off by having poems, dances, other performances, and songs. And they were able to mix with other children in that way who had come from different parts of Kenya. And we then went ahead and we had the hearings.
The children, the ones who testified, were not seen by the public. So they were with the commissioners. Then there was a barrier. There was like a wall. And what the public was hearing was only the voice. And some of them requested not to really have an in-camera, that is, no voice projection, no seeing them, and we respected that.
We had to come up with a balance between the protection and the right, but and one is not more important than the other. We had to make sure that both were observed and were observed strictly.
When you have a truth commission that has involved children, to do a child-friendly version report, so to have material that they can understand and they can access to, it's something mandatory. It's kind of you are reporting back to them.
Because children were so involved in the conflict in Sierra Leone, we also felt at some point it's not enough to involve them in statement taking and hearings, but it's a duty of the commission to sort of report back to them in a way, because you're asking them to testify and give you information and talk about their experiences, but you also need to provide them with something at the end of the process. So it was decided that our report was 4 volumes. You know, it's very comprehensive, so it's not accessible to children. So we decided to have child-friendly version in English and then subsequently translated into local languages, and then also a version for teenagers. So these 2 things were then used in schools and so on.
First goal is to get it drafted and vetted and accepted by children. We would like to see, as much as possible, the report disseminated also, but that is a second step. We'd like to see it drafted, and then once we determine with other line ministries, and I point directly to the Ministry of Education on the best way and the most effective way to incorporate it into the school system so that it actually becomes part of a learning process rather than a poster that goes on the wall. We want it talked about it. We want it part of civics education.
It's not only a question of making things easier to understand or more accessible depending on the cognitive development moment of the children, but it's also about how you're going to convey very, very difficult and sensitive information to children. And when you do that, you don't want to do it in a way that reinforces the sense of victimhood, but actually something that becomes a tool they can use to learn about how you can react to that.
They don't necessarily attach a political paradigm to what they've seen. They don't attach a religious paradigm to what they've seen. They just seen what they've seen. And so when you get an explanation from them, it hasn't been biased towards one political point of view or one religious point of view. And I think for younger children, it's the benefit of actually interviewing younger children.
Children will be innocent victims and caught up in situations that are not of their making. So it's very important to hear from children. They just say it as it is.
In terms of a commission using voices that are not controversial, when I heard children's testimonies, you couldn't ethnicize children and say this is an attempt by this ethnic community to portray this other community negatively. It was clearly a violation targeted at the vulnerability of the victim. And I think in terms of a commission being able to show the magnitude and the atrocity of certain acts, I think children are very powerful voices and compelling voices, and if no one else, I think children can persuade a country to make the necessary reforms.